What's up guys, today I'm going to show you how to drift in GTA 5. So in this guide, I'm going to do my best to go through pretty much everything you'll need to get started with drifting in GTA 5. I'm going to cover everything from game and controller settings, how to build and tune a great drift car, all the way to teaching you some basic drills to give you a good foundation for knowledge of drifting in this game. This guide is going to be very in-depth and long, so at any point in this video, feel free to skip ahead, pause, or replay portions as you need to. Now before we start off, I want to go through a few things. First of all, GTA 5 drifting is difficult and will take some time for you to learn. Now in addition to watching my drifting guides, you will need to put in a lot of practice time to further hone your skills. And if you're on Xbox, you can use the exact same map that I'm using in all of these guides to help yourself practice. Just head to the description if you want to get the social club job link to bookmark this job for yourselves. The next thing I want to say is that this drifting is all done without mods and can be done on all platforms. Another note is that this tutorial is mainly focused on controller drifting rather than using a keyboard. I would highly recommend using a controller to drift if you have access to one, as it gives you way more control over your car. However, if you choose to drift with a keyboard, the strategies covered in this guide will roughly translate over, plus I do have some additional keyboard specific tutorials linked in the description to help you guys further. Now finally, for anybody wondering, yes, I will be making both an intermediate and advanced drifting guide to build on everything that I cover in this video. In order to make things a little bit easier to process and to keep these videos to a reasonable length, I decided to split this guide up into 3 parts. So definitely do stick around for the channel because I will be dropping the next 2 guides very soon. So with that all out of the way, let's hop into the game and get started. Alright boys, let's quickly cover some game and controller settings I'd recommend you take a look at before drifting. First off, in the controls tab, make sure that you have vibration turned on, as this is going to give you some good tactile feedback from when your car is actually losing traction. The next thing to look at in controls is the option to switch your handbrake with duck or hydraulics. I'd recommend that you leave this set to off, meaning that you're going to use the right bumper as your handbrake when drifting. I think this feels a lot better and smoother than using the A or the X button. Next up, we'll pop over to audio settings, and in here we're going to make sure that the sound effects volume is turned up so you can actually hear your car when drifting, because this is really crucial for keeping your engine's revs in check. Next up, in camera settings, we're going to set the vehicle camera height to high. This is going to give you the best view of your car when drifting and will better allow you to plan out your lines and avoid any obstacles. So those are really all of the game settings I'd recommend you change. Everything else here is completely down to your personal preference. And the last thing I will say for this portion of the guides is to make sure that you are drifting in third person, because this is going to make the process of learning car control much easier. So with all of these settings sorted, let's move on to picking out our first drift car. Alright boys, so generally speaking, if you want to drift in GTA 5, you should be using a car that's front engine, rear wheel drive, and has decent power. So this means that a lot of the LS Tuners DLC cars and also cars in any of the sports and muscle categories are a good place to look. However, if you want a little bit more guidance on picking out a good drift car, definitely go ahead and check out my low grip tire drift build videos and also my past videos that cover the best drift cars in GTA 5. Now, if you're just starting out, here are some great beginner drift cars that I recommend to you. First off is the Willard Faction. This is an amazing budget drift car that, even though it is a bit sluggish, is still very smooth, consistent, and easy to drift at a variety of speeds. The next car is the Benefactor Schwarzer. This is one of the best beginner drift cars overall, since it's got very good power, decent handling, and can be purchased for very cheap or taken for free right off the street. Then we have the Karen Futo GTX, and this is the car I'm going to be using throughout the duration of this tutorial. I would highly recommend using this car to start off with because it has great power and awesome handling, and is one of the easiest cars to learn the basics of drifting in. It is pretty pricey, but overall I think the cost is definitely worth it. Now another good beginner drift car that you could use in place of the Futo GTX is the normal Futo. This car also has really good handling and is great for learning the basics, but it does have a little bit less power than the Futo GTX. However, at the same time, you can get it and upgrade it for much cheaper. So now that we picked out the car that we're going to drift, I'm going to quickly run through the 3 steps for building it up to drift the best. The first step is to take it to a mod shop and apply performance upgrades, and in order to have access to everything you'll need for this, definitely head to the mod shop in the LS Car Meet. Once you're there, head on in and apply the following upgrades: max engine, no spoiler or just leave whatever the stock options set to, lowest suspension, max transmission, turbo tuning, and low grip tires. Now, this setup should be a really good starting point for most of your drift builds. Anything that I don't cover here is down to your personal preference and won't really affect a car's drifting abilities. Now, the second step here is to stance your car, and because low grip tires are now available for most cars, I would consider stancing to be an optional step, because a lot of the time the combination of low grip tires and stance can actually make a car much harder to drive. However, for the sake of being thorough and in the event that you'll need it for your car, I'll explain this as quickly as I can. Now, there's two main ways of stancing your car. First off, for any car that's from the LS Tuners DLC, this is super easy. All you have to do is open up your interaction menu, head down to vehicles, and then in this menu, set your vehicle stance to lowered. Now, for any non-LS Tuners DLC car, you're going to have to stance your car manually, which basically means breaking your suspension with a weapon. So to do this, you have to take out any pistol, AR, SMG, or sniper rifle, obviously nothing too overpowered, and then you're going to aim into the lower half of the rim and start shooting. Do not pop the tires. Now, for most cars, you should see the car drop twice to the ground after you put enough shots into the bottom half of the rim. Now, if you don't see this happen, or if your car just explodes or sets on fire, you might have to shoot within the fender well or towards the bottom of the fenders to get the same stancing effect. Worst case scenario, the car cannot be stanced at all, and to figure all of this out, I recommend starting up a GTA class race, because in there you can use weapons and it doesn't matter if your car accidentally explodes. Now, whether or not you decide to stance your car, the third step in the process is fine-tuning it so you have the perfect setup. This is really just a matter of changing around the upgrades that mainly affect traction so you can nail down the best setup for the car that you're using. Now, for the Karen Fudo GTX I'll be using in this guide, the base setup that is discussed earlier without the lowered stance is just fine to start with and is also a really good base setup for the original Fudo as well. However, if you chose another car to start with, I will briefly revisit fine-tuning in future parts of this tutorial to help you guys further with this step. So, now that we're through all of this introductory stuff, it's finally time to drift. Let's head to the track. Alright boys, so really quickly, let's get familiar with the main controls we're going to be using for drifting. Now on the screen here is a picture of how I hold my controller, and throughout my experience drifting, this is the best way to hold it. First off, I have my left pointer finger over the left trigger. Now while we won't be using the brakes for much of this tutorial, this can definitely help for more advanced drifts you'll do in the future. Next up, I have my left thumb on the left stick, obviously to steer, and then moving to the right, I have my right thumb on the right stick so I can consistently reposition the camera while I'm drifting. I hinted at this a bit earlier in the settings portion, but having your right thumb on the right stick to keep the camera straight is super helpful. You can easily prevent the camera from moving all over the place with your car, and you can also aim the camera high above your car to better plan out your lines and avoid obstacles. I won't be explaining this too much more, so just keep an eye on the right stick during this tutorial and my future guides to see exactly how I'm doing this. Next up, I have my right pointer finger over the right bumper, which will allow me to quickly tap the handbrake whenever I need to while I'm drifting. And last but not least, I of course have my right middle finger over the right trigger in the back to control the throttle. Now for the sake of you guys being able to see all of my controller inputs when I'm drifting, I will have a controller camera on the right side of the screen here, and just to prevent any future confusion, the right bumper and the right trigger will start to turn white when I'm pressing them, and when I'm not using them, they'll just stay black. So we're finally on the track now, and let's start off our first drill that will cover how to control our car's power when drifting. This is done either by modulating the throttle or by tapping the handbrake. Now the goal of controlling our car's power is to prevent it from spinning out, while also keeping the car in first gear to prevent the revs from dropping if the car accidentally upshifts. These two skills will mainly come into play when we get into basic donuts and things like that, but you can feel out your car a bit better by doing the following things. First off, to get an idea of how much you'll have to modulate the throttle when you're drifting, start by holding down the handbrake, rev the car to redline, and then let off the handbrake to see how much the car wheel spins. Essentially, you're just launching the car. Now, if your car has a lot of power and spins a lot, you'll probably have to modulate the throttle more to keep the power controlled without spinning out during a drift. Now, if your car doesn't spin as much and finds grip pretty quickly, you'll probably have to work a bit less on the throttle to keep it sideways, and you can just hold it down. Now, to get a better idea of how often you'll need to tap the handbrake during a drift, follow the same process for launching the car and first listen for when it upshifts. Once you hear the revs climb up to redline and drop while the car is still building speed, you'll know the car has upshifted into second gear. What we're going to do now is launch the car again, and we're going to instead find a rhythm for tapping the handbrake to keep the car in first gear without shifting up. This is the same kind of trend we saw earlier when gauging initial wheel spin. If the car has less grip, you're probably going to have to tap the handbrake less to keep it in first gear, and the more grip your car has, the easier it will be to find traction and upshift, so you will probably need to tap the handbrake a bit more. Now with these two methods of power control covered, let's finally move into countersteering and how to work that into our basic drifts. Basically, the process of countersteering is finding a rhythm between steering into and opposite the direction of the drift to keep the car sideways without straightening or spinning out, but also guiding the front wheels in the direction of the drift. Now to get set up with finding this rhythm, it's best to start out near a small obstacle that you can easily drift around like a pole. Then what we're going to do is launch the car as we've done before by holding the handbrake, revving up the engine, and then releasing the handbrake. Keep the throttle floored, and once the front wheels of the car go slightly past the obstacle, then start to turn in the direction of the drift. Now in this case, I'm starting to the right of the pole because I want to start a drift going left or counterclockwise around it. Now doing this is fairly important for better feeling out the weight of your car and how easy it is to get sideways, because this in turn is going to help you get the rhythm down for countersteering and basically catching the car so you can keep that donut going without spinning out. Now the next thing we're going to do here is actually work in countersteering through a very simple 90-degree turn. We're going to follow the same process as before, basically launching the car and then turning into the direction of the drift. Now at this point the car will start to lose grip and drift, and once we've made it sideways through that 90-degree turn, we're basically going to catch the car and steer in the opposite direction so it straightens out and leaves the turn cleanly. The goal of this step is to get you comfortable with feeling your car's limits with steering angle and how aggressively you're going to need to countersteer to accomplish whatever drift you're trying to do. So with that all covered, we're now going to actually put together the skills of power control and countersteering to get some basic donuts going around a simple obstacle. We're going to start off easy. First, we'll launch our car like we did before, and then turn in the direction of the drift as our front wheels go slightly past the obstacle we want to drift around. Now from here, we're going to repeat the process of catching the car that I showed you guys previously with the simple 90-degree drift. Now, after you catch the car, instead of straightening out, you're going to start turning back in the direction of the initial drift, and the car is going to start doing a donut motion. From here, try to figure out a rhythm for steering left and right, basically steering into the direction of the drift to keep the car sliding around the obstacle, and steering opposite the direction of the drift to guide the front wheels around the obstacle. At the same time, you're going to work in the methods of power control, either by tapping the handbrake or controlling how much throttle you're applying. Just to start out so it doesn't get too confusing, you can rely just on the handbrake to keep power controlled while you try to find that rhythm with countersteering. Now once you get more comfortable with doing a simple donut and can do it successfully without spinning out, you should start to rely less on the handbrake and instead try to control the car's power just by using the throttle. Here, as you'll see, I actually won't need to work as hard when countersteering, as I can use the car's power to my advantage to keep a controlled slide going. This is a concept that a lot of people like to call steering with the throttle, as you're inducing oversteer with more throttle rather than with more steering angle. You can see this happening pretty clearly by looking at my steering inputs. Rarely am I actually steering in the direction of the drift to keep the car sideways, because the car's power is doing that for me. I only really need to focus on steering in the opposite direction to guide the car around the obstacle without spinning out. Now next up, we're going to take a look at proximity, or basically how close we're getting to the obstacle we're drifting around. Now typically, the tighter the donut is, the more effort you're going to need to put into countersteering to make the finer adjustments necessary to keep the front wheels as close as possible to the obstacle. This is also going to make the process of power control a bit easier, as you won't need to worry much about the car picking up too much speed, and you can rely on those steering inputs to correct anything if necessary. However, occasionally letting off the throttle and or tapping the handbrake can make these tighter drifts a little bit smoother. Now on the other hand, the wider the donut is, the more effort you'll need to put into controlling your car's power. This is for two reasons. One, we want to prevent our car from totally spinning out because our wheel speed is going to increase for a wider drift. And two, we want to make sure our car doesn't pick up too much speed that it upshifts in the second gear and totally falls out of power. Now to keep the wider donut going, you'll see that I'll rely more on modulating the throttle and occasionally tapping the handbrake while not countersteering as much, since I'm letting the car's power guide me through that wide drift. By controlling the throttle in this way, I can induce more oversteer when I need to, and by periodically letting off the gas, I'm preventing the car from shifting up by picking up too much speed. Now, if you do notice that the car has upshifted and the revs drop and it's really hard to control the drift any further, you can tap the handbrake a couple times to kick the transmission back into first gear to keep a drift going. Now, in terms of changing proximity while you're drifting, you can transition into a tighter donut, typically by steering more into the direction of the drift, or by giving the car more throttle and trying to bring the front wheels closer to the obstacle. And then on the opposite, transitioning to a wider donut, you're going to steer in the opposite direction of the drift and apply a bit less throttle to bring the front wheels further away from the obstacle, and then resume normal countersteering as you would for a simple donut. Alright boys, so now let's work in transitions where we're actually going to change the direction of our drift. And since we're already familiar with the ideas of power control and countersteering, this should be fairly easy for us to do. We're going to first start by launching our car and turning into the drift as if we're going to start doing a simple donut. However, about halfway to 3/4 of the way through one full donut around the obstacle, we're going to bias our steering opposite the direction of that original drift to get the car sideways in the other direction. Keep steering opposite the direction of the drift until you feel your car start to pull out of the donut and slide in the other direction. Again, it feels like we're not doing anything meaningful here, but this should ultimately help you get a feel for how your car's weight will shift during transitions, which in turn will help you better understand how much grip your car has and how aggressively you're going to need to steer in order to accomplish a successful transition. Now with this basic idea in mind, we're now going to factor in the idea of catching the car after you complete a transition so we can keep a drift going in the opposite direction. Now the simplest way to implement this is by doing a figure 8 between two obstacles that are reasonably spaced apart. If you're doing a custom map for this, make sure that these obstacles aren't super close together, but also that they aren't a mile apart, because that would make it unnecessarily hard. So once we've got that set up, we're going to launch the car and initiate as we've done before, and we're going to follow the same process of initiating a transition when we're almost halfway through a normal donut around the first obstacle. Now at this halfway point, we're going to turn in the opposite direction to get the car's weight to shift and initiate a drift in the opposite direction. From here, we're going to catch the car as the front wheels approach the other obstacle and start countersteering in the same way as we've done before. Now in this case, I'm going to start in a leftwards counterclockwise drift around the first pole. Then about halfway through my full rotation around the first pole, I'm going to start steering to the right to get the car sideways in a clockwise or rightward direction around the second pole. Now from here, I'm going to fall into a new rhythm of countersteering left and right, and I'll transition back to a counterclockwise drift around the first pole when I start to get more comfortable with transitions. Now another thing you can do to help make the process of transitioning easier is to use the methods of power control to help get the car rotating in the opposite direction. You can do this either by letting off the throttle to allow the car to catch a little bit of grip, and then flooring the throttle to induce oversteer while turning in the other direction. You can also do this by pressing the handbrake, as this will slow the car down enough and also help you catch a little bit of grip. Then, once you release the handbrake, you can then start steering in the opposite direction to floor the throttle and induce oversteer in the same way. Now, as a continuation of these two previous drills, another great way to nail down the timing and precision of your transitions is to drift in a slalom-like motion. Using objects spaced evenly and in line with each other, around 3 to 4 car lengths apart, we're going to initiate our drift as normal and then start doing rapid-fire transitions between counterclockwise and clockwise drifts. Basically, think about a car doing slaloms in between cones on a track. We're going to do the same here, except we're going to do it while we're actually drifting. All of the previous skills we learned about countersteering and power control will come into play here, as we'll be combining these to ensure that we can consistently and smoothly drift through all of these obstacles. And you'll notice a pretty clear trend in timing here. As I start to transition and bias my steering inputs in the opposite direction of the previous drift, my car will start to change direction at about the halfway point between each of the subsequent poles. Now, once you get into the groove of doing quick transitions like this, you will start to become way more aware of when your car's weight is actually shifting, so that way you have better insight on when you should be timing your transitions. And obviously, I'm also controlling my car's power via the throttle and the handbrake, so I can stay on that smooth kind of S-shaped line without picking up too much speed or spinning the car out. So in this section, we went over a lot, including the main controls we're going to be using and how to best hold our controller when drifting, how to control our car's power when drifting, either through tapping the handbrake or by modulating the throttle, and how to initiate slower drifts and countersteer properly to keep the car in a controlled slide. We then applied these basic skills in the form of simple donuts, and after this, we discussed the basics of transitions and applied this idea to figure 8 and slalom drifts. So long as you master everything we've just gone through, you will have a very good understanding of your car and the basics of car control. Now, building off of everything we learned here, the next intermediate level drifting guide will explain how to properly apply these skills to entries and full-on drifting lines. So that, boys, is about everything I wanted to cover to show you guys the basics of beginner drifting in GTA 5. The main goal of working through these drills is to get you comfortable with your car and the various ways in which you can control it for drifting. I really hope this tutorial ended up being helpful for you and not too overwhelming. As always, if you guys have any problems or questions related to GTA 5 drifting, then don't hesitate to ask me in the comments, and I'll do my best to give you a good answer. Additionally, stick around the channel for the intermediate and advanced level drifting guides coming very soon. Thank you all so much for watching and for supporting my channel, and have an amazing day.